Back in 2019, I was employed at a food market, typically handling closing shifts, and I resided alone in a compact studio apartment. We had numerous familiar faces at our establishment, patrons who frequented the place consistently, usually around the same hours as well. One of these clients was a fellow who visited right before closing a couple of times per week. No one knew his name, but everyone was aware of him because no one appreciated patrons who arrived 10 minutes prior to the store's closure. Usually being the sole cashier, I was the one engaging with him. He was consistently somewhat peculiar. He didn't converse much and always possessed a weary look on his face. This specific evening, he entered as he always did, just before closing, picking up a few items and proceeding to the register. I scanned everything, he paid, and he departed. We didn't exchange any words besides a simple greeting. 10 minutes later, I shut down the register and spent a few minutes tidying up, clocking out and leaving at 10:15. As I walked out to my vehicle, I observed the man was still in the parking area. He was positioned awkwardly outside of his automobile, with his hands at his sides, simply gazing at the store. I entered my car and drove home. I didn't have work the subsequent day, so I remained awake a bit later than usual. I didn't get into bed until probably 1 a.m. However, mere moments after getting under the covers, a radiant light shone into my bedroom through one of the windows. I assumed it was a neighbor parking, so I didn't really mind it. After a second, the light switched off, which subconsciously reassured me that it was just headlights. I fell asleep only a couple of minutes afterward. I awoke in the night to what I perceived was my phone chiming. The manner I awoke, half asleep and in the midst of a dream, made it difficult to discern what was genuine and what wasn't. I rubbed my eyes and tapped my phone on the nightstand. It was blank. No texts or calls had arrived. I wasn't sure what to contemplate. I intended to simply disregard it and return to slumber, as I wasn't even fully conscious yet to begin with, but the slightest thing caught my attention. As I rolled back over, the bedroom door was barely ajar, not even sufficiently to permit any light in or anything. It was just uneven with the door frame, not latched shut. I invariably closed the door to my room, so seeing it not fully shut immediately roused me. I rose from bed and walked over, pushing it closed to see if perhaps it was stuck for some reason. It smoothly latched into the door frame just like it always did, so there was no way I'd mistakenly left it open. I felt my body become shaky. My heart was racing, but even with everything suggesting otherwise, I still attempted to persuade myself that this was somehow insignificant. I tried to conceive of any plausible way that this was something not to worry about, but my mind recalled the light I saw before falling asleep. I walked over to the window and peered through the blind. There was a car parked in my driveway. I could only view the back portion of it, but I instantly felt a surge of panic. Who was at my residence, and was someone inside with me? I hurried over to the door again and switched on the lights. I stood there by the door, panicking and contemplating, realizing I should contact 911 just to be safe. I glanced at the nightstand that my phone was on, and just before I began to walk over there, I saw an eye looking back at me from a gap in the closet. My body trembled, and I emitted a gasp, then spun around and bolted out of my house. By the time I located a neighbor who would answer their door and contact the police for me, at least 15 minutes had elapsed already. The car in my driveway was still present when officers appeared, but the man was absent. It didn't take long for them to utilize the car to locate him, though, and I felt sick when it turned out to be the man from the food market. His explanations for everything didn't make any sense, but it was evident he'd been observing me for a while now, and he was not well-intentioned. I believe the only reason I'd awakened that night was because the man's phone rang while he was concealed, and he silenced it just as I woke up. If not for that, I don't know what would have transpired to me, or if I'd even be alive right now. The memory of that tempestuous evening still sends shivers down my spine. It serves as a constant reminder that trust is a fragile thing, easily shattered, regardless of perceived intimacy. I was 19, a recent graduate of Bible college, and the church had granted me my first pastoral role, a youth ministry position in a quiet, rural Missouri town. It was a tranquil setting, featuring a modest cafe, a school, a small park, and the church that employed me. Initially, it was challenging. I was an out-of-stater, hundreds of miles from anything familiar, devoid of friends or connections. But this changed upon meeting Adam. We quickly formed a bond. He served as the children's pastor, while my focus was on teenagers, making us part of the same team. We often shared lunches, and I'd frequently visit his home after work for conversation and television. We became close, and he was arguably my closest confidant in that region. One night, Adam stayed at my place for a movie, and I felt a twinge of unease when he emerged from the bathroom in just tight pants and no shirt. While I valued his friendship, as time progressed, a growing discomfort settled within me. The first peculiarity was his physique. He was remarkably tall, around 6 feet 2 inches, with elongated, thin arms and legs, yet his torso was stout, almost resembling those cartoonish frogs from classic animation. His face was somewhat round, he was nearly bald, and he wore oversized spectacles. Another unusual trait was his voice. One would anticipate a deep voice from such a large man, but the reality was quite the opposite. His voice was unusually high-pitched, and he addressed me and others with a childish intonation, like one uses when speaking to young children, adopting a cartoonish, gentle tone. He also exhibited numerous tics. His head and shoulders would sometimes twitch involuntarily, and during these spasms, his tongue, seemingly 7 inches long, would protrude. I attempted to disregard these traits, believing in judging people by their inner qualities, not their outward appearance. Besides, Adam had assisted me with moving and settling into my new residence, creating a sense of obligation. But while his looks and tics were unsettling, his strange fixation on me was truly disturbing. He constantly sought my company, seizing every opportunity. Sometimes, I would return from the restroom to find a dozen missed calls from him. I often felt pressured to agree to his requests, which involved hours of conversation in his mother's cafe or watching tedious shows, instead of more masculine activities, or interrupting my video game sessions with calls about his desire for children, an incredibly bizarre topic. Gradually, these encounters pushed me away. On one occasion, he invited me shopping, and I stipulated that it had to be brief due to a teen service that evening. He consented, but upon returning to his car, he locked the doors and drove aimlessly, laughing and humming, declaring, "You're not leaving, you're staying with me." After an hour of this, with the music blaring, I felt a surge of panic. I remember becoming angry and yelling for him to return me to the church. He retaliated with anger at my outburst and punched me in the groin. The pain was excruciating, causing me to shriek. "I can't bear you anymore," I managed to say, but he remained silent, driving back in stony silence. Adam's actions caused me to be late for the teen service, where I faced a group of irate parents who had been waiting for nearly 45 minutes. I knew I had reached my breaking point. The next time Adam invited me out, I declined. I was done. But he was unwilling to let go. He would call and text almost nightly, crying and pleading, a 26-year-old man sounding like a heartbroken teenage girl. This sadness would then morph into passive aggression when we encountered each other at church. It was deeply uncomfortable. Even during Sunday sermons, I would catch him staring at me with a haunting expression, as if oblivious to the service, lost in some disturbing fantasy involving me. Eventually, Adam left his church position for a teaching job. He seemed to have found new companions, and I was relieved. It felt like a dark cloud had dissipated. A year passed. I was now married with a young child, and had almost forgotten about Adam when he suddenly called. I suggested we meet, and he seemed much more composed, as if his new social circle had helped him become more normal. We had lunch, and he invited me to his school's soccer game. I hesitated, but with my wife and child out of town visiting family, I agreed. During the game, a sudden downpour escalated into a violent storm with high winds. The game was cancelled, and everyone was instructed to return to their vehicles. As we reached our cars, a tornado siren blared. The weather had shifted dramatically. Since I lived nearly an hour away, Adam suggested I stay at his place until the danger subsided. Tornadoes in the Midwest were a serious threat, so I unwisely agreed. This decision proved to be a grave error. What should have been a 5-minute drive turned into 20. Upon arriving at his residence, he gave me a tour of the unsettlingly decorated place, filled with antique dolls and odd objects reminiscent of a thrift store. Despite the strange decor, the evening began uneventfully. We watched a home improvement show, enjoyed snacks and beverages, and it was a relaxing way to wait out the storm. Around 1:30 a.m., with the storm still raging, we decided to stay the night. I requested a pillow and blanket for the couch, but he insisted, No, my room is better. There's plenty of space. I was uncomfortable, but, due to his insistence, I relented. In his room, I found a hard bed, a small Mickey Mouse blanket, and a flat pillow. After hours of restless tossing and turning, around 2 a.m., I heard Adam's voice in the dark. You can join me on the bed. There's lots of room. I firmly declined, but half an hour later, he asked again, Are you sure you're all right? Exhausted and with a sore back, I finally gave in. I lay on my back, facing the ceiling, and noticed him repeatedly trying to get closer. Thinking he was half asleep, I shifted away. This occurred several times until I was nearly falling off the bed. He then slid towards me again, and I turned my back to him, feigning sleep. Suddenly, everything went silent, and I felt his long, thin arms encircle me, pulling me against his flabby chest. He squeezed me tightly and rubbed his rough face against my head. I somehow managed to escape his grasp, grabbing my pillow and blanket and fleeing to the couch. I lay there, counting the seconds until the storm subsided. My mind reeled from the recent event. I felt utterly repulsed. I moved the couch next to the sliding glass doors in the darkened living room. Only the lightning flashes and the deafening thunder and rain illuminated the scene. It was at this moment that true terror struck. As I lay there, my back to the window, I could see into Adam's room. A lightning bolt illuminated everything, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I saw Adam's silhouette standing in the doorway. I froze, my heart pounding, feigning sleep. Then, another lightning flash revealed what I can only describe as a real-life slender man standing above me. My blood ran cold. Adam leaned over, humming a creepy lullaby, playing with my hair and smiling strangely. He then retreated to his room, whispering, I'll see you again. This was the most terrifying moment of my life. As soon as his door closed, I bolted downstairs to the basement, out the back door, and into my car in the pouring rain, feeling his presence behind me. I fumbled with the keys until the engine roared to life. I looked up, and he was there again, under the back door frame like a slender man. I drove away as fast as I could. Shortly after, my wife and I relocated for a new job and church. Things improved significantly. Adam attempted to contact me several times before we moved, but I never responded. Eventually, his calls and messages ceased, and I never spoke to him again. To this day, I regret my naivety. I always tried to see the best in people, but after this experience, it's difficult. I sometimes wonder what Adam would have done if I had actually fallen asleep in his bed. It's a haunting thought. It taught me that trust must be earned cautiously, and that predators can appear in the most unexpected forms. I reside in a modest dwelling in a reasonably good neighborhood, and I also telecommute. My workspace is situated upstairs in a compact room with my desk positioned by a window that overlooks the front of the house. I enjoyed being able to open it for ventilation or appreciate the scenery when the weather was pleasant. This occurred as autumn was beginning, so my window was typically open all day. One typical weekday around midday, I was performing my usual tasks at my desk when I observed something outside. There was an individual, a male, standing at the edge of my driveway, not passing by or pausing to adjust a shoelace or anything. He was simply standing there and gazing up at my residence. I couldn't discern if he could perceive me at the window or not, but after only a brief moment of me observing him, he departed. I found it quite peculiar, but that was all. What else was I supposed to contemplate or perform? I persisted with my work, occasionally glancing out the window, but seeing nothing further, I wasn't overly concerned. The subsequent day, I followed the same routine. I commenced work and remained quite occupied throughout the day, participating in numerous video conferences with my colleagues. During one of these meetings, I became distracted and happened to peek out the window once more. The same man was present, standing in the same location at the driveway's end and looking up at the house, just as he had before. Something about this instance felt significantly more disturbing and unsettling. Why was he returning? I must have stared at him for a while, because one of my colleagues noticed my worried expression and inquired if everything was all right. I responded affirmatively and attempted to refocus on the meeting. I continued to glance back. He remained there for a minute. Then I looked again, and he was absent. The remainder of my workday felt protracted. I couldn't cease thinking about this random person gazing at my house. It was so strange. After finishing work, I ventured outside and walked around my driveway, searching for any justification for them to be looking up at my house in that manner. Everything appeared normal. However, I did realize that my office window was clearly visible from where the man was standing, implying he could likely see me observing him. I re-entered the house and prepared dinner. I conversed with my brother that evening and mentioned the incident. He concurred that it was strange but suggested it was likely nothing. After concluding the call, I sat down and watched television, hoping to distract myself. A few hours elapsed. It was perhaps 9 p.m. The television's volume was low because I was becoming tired, but with the reduced sound, I could hear what I believed were footsteps outside my house. I abruptly rose from the sofa and stared at the front entrance. The footsteps approached, pausing briefly before receding. I quickly moved to the door and peered through the peephole. I could faintly discern a figure walking towards the street. Once they were gone, I opened the door immediately. I discovered a note affixed to the back. It was brief, simply stating, "Pat, answer the door." I was not only perplexed but terrified. How did they know my name, and what was the note supposed to signify? They didn't even knock or remain long enough for me to have answered the door, not that I would have done so anyway. This prompted me to contact the police. 2 officers arrived, and I recounted everything. Unfortunately, there wasn't much they could do. They essentially documented everything and advised me to call them if anything else occurred. It didn't make me feel much better. I remained awake late that night, lying in bed, unable to sleep. I literally remained there for hours, contemplating this man who was observing my house, the unsettling note he left, and then, just before 2 a.m., a knock at the front door echoed through the otherwise silent house. My body froze. The house's silence became deafening as I listened in fear. After a few seconds, they knocked again. My heart began to race. I retrieved my phone and dialed 911. They dispatched officers promptly, but the knocking persisted throughout my wait. Eerily, it never became louder, more rushed, or aggressive. It was just the same repetitive knocking. The operator informed me that the police were 2 minutes away, and just after that, there was a longer interval between the knocking, 15 seconds, then 30, then a full minute passed. When the officers arrived, nobody was at the door. They were too late again. I informed them of what transpired, and they seemed to take it a bit more seriously this time, but it still wasn't sufficient for them to take any action. They stated they would have an officer patrol the area for the next couple of weeks. Those weeks passed, and the man never returned to my door or the driveway's edge, at least to my knowledge. Months have passed, and still nothing else. It still frightens me, though. The thought of the creepy note instructing me to answer the door, and then the knocking at 2 a.m., is simply terrifying. There's also the lingering thought of them returning. I don't know their intentions, their identity, or if they're truly gone permanently. This transpired during my freshman year of secondary education. The hamlet I resided in was diminutive and arguably quite conventional compared to contemporary locales. It was exceptionally forested, and the structures and dwellings weren't densely packed. My abode was situated within the forest. My parents possessed a considerable amount of land, and my father had constructed the residence with his progenitor. Consequently, it lacked a proper thoroughfare or access road. It was more of an unpaved pathway. Thus, the school vehicles didn't have a designated stop at our property. I would either have to traverse a mile to my companion's dwelling for conveyance or simply proceed the additional distance directly to the institution. Typically, I would just proceed the entire distance to the institution. This was a standard day, as far as I could ascertain. I was proceeding along the path from my residence, relishing the tranquil morning acoustics of the forest, when I discerned a vehicle ahead. It wasn't my parents' vehicle or anyone else's I recognized, and it was simply stationary on the path. This path exclusively connected to and from the dwelling, so someone being present was atypical. I'm unsure if I'd ever observed a random vehicle there previously. This generated a sense of unease about having to bypass it. There was a female occupant within. She appeared 35 or 40, with dark circles beneath her eyes and unkempt dark hair. She glanced at me, but I merely averted my gaze. I could perceive her observation as I proceeded. I accelerated my gait and arrived at the institution. During supper that evening, I mentioned it to my parents, inquiring about her identity and purpose. Both appeared anxious and perplexed. They informed me the female must have simply become disoriented, and I shouldn't be concerned, but I could perceive the apprehension in their expressions. They transported me to the institution for the subsequent week, which was peculiar because they both commenced employment early, around 6 a.m., so they must have reported late for the entire week solely to transport me. Honestly, I perceived it as an overreaction, as I felt I was sufficiently mature to manage myself, but I comprehended my parents' protective intentions. On Monday morning of the ensuing week, I gathered my school supplies and commenced walking. During the preceding week I had been conveyed, we never encountered the female or the vehicle, so I genuinely wasn't apprehensive any longer. However, this instance, upon reaching the identical location in the forest, she was present again, seated within her vehicle, observing me. I experienced a minor panic attack. This was excessive to be a coincidence. Appearing twice on the path that was essentially our access route, stationary in the identical location, and solely appearing when I was traversing alone. I resolved to traverse through the forest instead of passing her again. I took a few paces off the path, but immediately the female noticed. She initiated her vehicle and propelled closer to me. I feigned indifference, proceeding more rapidly into the forest. I detected her vehicle door opening and her footsteps crunching on the foliage behind me, but then she uttered my name, like my complete name, in this eerily composed and affectionate tone. I rotated my head and observed her. She possessed this vacant stare and expressionless countenance. Her eyes were fatigued and heavy, and she exhibited this unhealthy appearance. I sprinted away, and after losing sight of her, I circumnavigated through the forest to my residence, where I contacted my parents. They notified the authorities and returned home promptly. What I didn't anticipate was my parents recognizing the female precisely. It was my father's former spouse from nearly 2 decades prior. Apparently, she'd experienced mental instability for some time and would undergo these terrifying occurrences where she'd become fixated on something and execute unsettling actions. The day I informed them I observed her, my parents reported it to the constabulary, knowing it had to be her. The constabulary neglected to undertake any action, merely checking on her and stating she appeared normal for that entire week, though she had been stalking our dwelling. Knowing that each instance my parents departed for employment early, it signified I would be traversing alone to the institution. My parents never disclosed what transpired to her subsequently, or what she was attempting to perpetrate to me, or why she was perpetrating any of it. Hopefully, nothing analogous transpires again. If these chilling stalker stories gave you the creeps, be sure to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. What would you have done differently in these situations? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Send this video to a friend who might find it interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.